Hi, Nathan.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you, sir?
Well, I'm okay. And I thought today for our discussion would be your award winning film, which won an award in 2024 with the First Amendment, Between Lion and Lambs.
Thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, I made a short film. It's 10.5 minutes. We'll discuss it as you very kindly have said. Let's go. Let's have a dialogue. And I do
Yes.
apologize, but I'm going to play it.
So,
Please
Mark,
excuse the technical hiccup, Nathan. There, I do apologize. Go
don't
for
worry, it's been a busy week for both of us. Well, Between Lion and Lambs, then, Mark, you've made this film a few years ago. It won an award last year, the First Amendment. So, can you give people listening a brief overview of what the film's about?
Thank you. The film, believe it or not, was loaded up in 2015 on the 4th of July, a year before, round about the same time that President Trump announced that he was running for the presidency of the United States, which he then went on to win in 2016. If we take our memory bank and we stretch it, we can remember that he was running against Hillary Clinton. People may be aware of who that interesting piece of work is. Look her up. He then ran. Of course, he came down the escalator with his dear wife, Melania, announced the fact that his candidacy. I had no idea that he was going to do that. I had no idea what was coming. Of course, I don't have a direct contact with the White House, maybe through a friend, but I don't have that. So that was interesting that all that was going on. As someone that has been very, very much interested very deeply in American politics for a long time. And then, of course, this is important to say, 2015, that happened. In 2016, he won the presidency for his first administration. And we also had the Brexit vote as well. So the film, just set in that political context of where we were at, because that's rather interesting to think about where we are at now.
Yeah.
So the film takes the book of Daniel and sets it amongst the political machinations of Washington politics. It's 10.5 minutes long. I'd just like to say, and I'd like to urge everyone to go and find it on YouTube, and I'll put the notes in. But I'd just like to say that it is censored on YouTube. They never let it go beyond 20,000. And after all these years, I have not put it on Rumble or any other anyone else. And I will in time do that. So it depicts a time. It takes the book of Daniel and sets it amongst the machinations of Washington politics. It depicts a time when the Constitution of the United States has been suspended and there's complete overreach by the executive branch. The president portrayed in it is President Nebuchadnezzar, played by the actor Patterson Joseph. Any sort of reference, because Patterson is a black man, any reference that is being made that maybe some people could subtly say, oh, are you referring to Obama? I can't possibly say, Nathan. I can't possibly say. But what I will say is this. Now, I can't easily show it because of the background I've got, so I want to read this book. In 2013, I found myself on a beach, and as I will do, take some books to read. And I had Pamela Geller with Robert Spencer. They wrote a book, The Post-American President, the Obama administration's war on America. And with all having woken up, as we're called that phrase in 2010, to realize that we do live in a matrix, and it is a load of it is theatre, and it may not be aware, we may not be fully aware of how these things are then portrayed. I then read that book and just went, oh my goodness me. And then I met someone who wrote something proposing this, and then I got that individual to write the short film. And then I said, I will pull this off, which I did. And I admit I did it as a warning to the future 2016 election and what was coming up. Is it something that I'd love to see as a feature film? Oh, of course, we all the time. There's been a lot of adventures in between that gap between 2015 and now, so and it's not as easy as people think. But anyway, I made it as a warning. So it depicts a time when the Constitution of the United States has been suspended, a complete overreach by the executive branch. And I'd like to, even though I'm not comfortable with it, but I'd like to say that it's still as relevant today as it was in 2015. Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer, who wrote that book, I hope to interview Robert Spencer. And also within the book, as I discovered the other day, that reminded me, Nathan, because this is important. There's a wonderful gentleman who's no longer with us, but called Christopher Booker, that's mentioned in the book. And Christopher Booker and dear Richard North wrote a book called The History of Europe and the Great Deception, because in 2016, I then went on to produce and direct for Richard Flexit, the movie of how the UK could leave the EU and protect its economy and flourish. So I was in the middle thickly of trying to wake people up and draw people's attention to what I feel is going on. And because the EU, in my own humble opinion, is a leg of global governance. And also, even though some people still worship the ground he walks on, but if people would actually study Barack Hussein Obama and realize who he is and where he comes from, and he is, as far as I'm concerned, he was a member of the Social Democrats of America. As far as I'm concerned, he is a communist. So that's some of the history behind the short film. And thank you so much for asking me that, because I'm just going to say this, my dear friend, is that in many ways, you're the second person that sort of asked me about it. There's never been, I had an opportunity recently to explain all that and what was behind it. So thank you for that.
No, thank you. I think that helps people understand. And like you said, I encourage people to follow the link later on and actually go and watch it. It's only 10 minutes, 30 seconds, but it does open people's eyes, because you can now look at it retrospectively and see what you were saying. But also there's so much for us today. So how applicable do you think it is for today, both in the US and let's also say the UK?
Well, what we've got is we've got a power grab. And one thing that I don't think enough people have joined up, and partly is because on mainstream media there's one particular subject that is not talked about, which is January the 6th, 2021, and in the presidential election of 2020, President Trump lost. Now, the reasons for losing that spiritually, we can come back to, right? But he lost. Then on January the 6th, 2021, patriots in America took their rights to protest and make their voices heard to the White House. On that day, 5 people died, or 4 people died, and 1 person died after. So you had dear Ashley Babbitt, Kevin Greason, Benjamin Phillips, and Roseanne Boylan, and Officer Signick, who then died the following day, because he had chest problems, and he was taken to the police lines by the Patriots, and then sadly he died the next day. The Patriots were then accused of hitting him with a fire extinguisher, which they did not. That an apology refuting all that, or an excuse of an apology, I wouldn't say that as an apology, a very small paragraph at the back of a well-known newspaper over there was put in to say that that was not true, even though the facts they were pushing that as fact. So what you then had was the Jan 6 stitch up. Ashley Babbitt was shot by Michael Bird. That awful event was very clearly shown over time in footage. And I just would like to give a big shout out to my dear friend David Summerall of stophate.com in America. Please go on and look at his documentaries about all of that, 4 of them, where he has been fighting for justice and to draw people's attention to what had gone on. And people still don't believe what had gone on. So Roseanne Boyland was beaten to death by a police officer up there called Myla Morrison. Morrison was then taken, given a big prime seat at the Super Bowl. Philip Anderson tried to save Roseanne Boyland's life. I've had the privilege to meet Philip, as well as Ashley's mother. And then we had Kevin Grease and Benjamin Phillips that were affected by flash bombs and grenades that had been fired onto the Patriot crowds round about 1:06 on that day. And the reason why the Patriots were going there was to make their voices heard, and had been invited by President Trump to then march peacefully and patriotically. And remember that day, Nancy Pelosi had turned down the National Guard to attend the White House, attend the People's House, and guard out there. In November of 2019, again, the Patriots had another march, which meant that the opposition could observe how they march, how they conduct themselves, where they go to. And basically, January the 6th, 2021, is very easy to say it in hindsight. It was a complete setup, and the police opened fired, and the Patriots were protecting themselves. And remember, the children were in the crowd. There's so much to say on this, but there is a link, and I would ask people to go on stophate.com to look, also to go on and buy books called The American Gulag Chronicles, which is to support money to support the J6 prisoners. There were 3 books that have been produced. There were 1,600 arrests after that. People on trumped up charges of accidentally standing on the grass, or I'm just trying to think of a wonderful couple, the Middletons, where they're kneeling and praying on the grass, and then Jaleese opens her eyes to find that her husband is being beaten by the police there, and she launches in to protect her husband. They then get arrested, end up going in prison a couple of years later for a month, maybe 2 months. Now, this is all real. This is what happened. So when you relate it to the film, and I don't sit here, Nathan, as any prophet. I don't. But there are things that you and I can see, like many others, when we're looking at what is actually happening because of now what we're particularly living in within our own country. So at the beginning of the film, it talks about, endless war raged, money was manipulated until it meant nothing. And then later on, you see the police dressed up in their full riot gear. Now, in the film, some of the graphics that a dear friend of mine created, So, we'd filmed the first scene, filmed the middle, and then it needed an end. And the graphics set the stage, set the mood, set the atmosphere, or paint the world, as we call it in film terms, of what is going on. So the fact that it's about taking rights away, and Daniel Alesso is the congressman, senator who's standing up against the president and the abuse of power. And as he says, there always going to be people that will stand up to him, like as a rebellion. As he said, there'll always be a few of us. So that's how that's portrayed in there, Nathan, at that time. It's really quite interesting when you start to talk about your own work, and even though you've been immersed in it a number of years ago and there's bits you forget, but it's also, in one sense, it's quite hard to talk about, because to me the film just says it all.
Yes.
And there's the riot graphic at the beginning was based on the 2014 situation in the Ukraine and the overthrow there. And then I'd asked Nick to draw 1984 on one of the banners. So I had a field day in the fact that I was really being upfront with the messages if people would spend a bit of time looking at it. At one point, Ron Paul is depicted, a big libertarian in America. So why do I think it's relevant today? Because it's about tyranny, because we've seen people's rights disappear. And I do apologize. Go back to Jan 6. We had the events of January the 6th. Then at that time, because of the whole lockdown and the novid of stupidity that meant people had to maybe take something into their body, we then had the Convoy in Canada, because after Canada being shut down, and the very brave, one of the leaders of that being Tamara Leash, and her other friend, Michael, and I've forgotten his surname. And they have just been given a ridiculously heavy sentence for that, because it's a way of trying to shut people up. So they've got to be tied up in their houses for a year and all this. So that had been an ongoing court case. But we'd had Jan 6, we'd had Canada. Then we have got to remember that round about September, October 2023, there was a meeting in Canada with Justin Trudeau. And I believe, I think if I got my facts right, we had Jacinda Ardern there. We had Keir Starmer there, and having a meeting. Now, I will find this. I'm not sure. I need to, off the top of my head, I'm not sure if Tony Blair was there. Wouldn't surprise me, or even Mark Carney. So when you say, well, what relevance does it have? It has a very, very big relevance, because we now have Keir Starmer in power. Keir Starmer, who is a very suspect individual with some of his links with what he has been up to. And I just draw people's attention to the director of public prosecution's role that he has, to look into his past. You and I on another day will go through that. But if you go on a group called the Trilateral Commission, you will find out that he was a member of that globalist group from 2017, 2018, and stood down in 2022. Also, member of the Fabian Society, like many other members of the Labour Party. And I have here in my hand, which is The Practice and Theory of Bolshevism by Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, this was written in 1920, and it's talking about the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia, referring to all that, how the decline, how capitalism has to be replaced. And just to remind ourselves that capitalism out of any system has taken more people out of poverty than any other system. Is it perfect? No, but there's a lot to explore with that. So when you say to me, how relevant is this? We'll come back to this meeting on October 23. Look at where we are now in regard to the fact that we have this thing called the Online Safety Bill in the UK that was started by the Tories, who call themselves the Conservative Party, pushed through by brought about by a lady called Nadine Dorries. So if we think that we can blame the recent government that come about on July the 4th, 2024, you're absolutely mistaken. Go back many years and look at what's going on. And that also refers to our digital autocracy that they want to create. So this whole thing with the online safety bill is very interesting because of what Mark Carney is pushing through in Canada in regard to that, which is then taking people off the internet if they don't have the right views, and also with our tie-up to creating a social credit system like they have in China. I just want to quickly mention that I made a short film. I produced another short film in 2017, written by the same writer and directed by him, Ted Wilkes. Now, superb editor, friend of mine, Tristan, who also was credited with being the other director on Iris Echo. That was a depiction of a warning against communism. I did not mean that to be prophetic either. But the Fabian Society, Bertrand Russell and co, and the Webbs, the Webbs started the London School of Economics. Also, there's an involvement there with the New Statesman. And the Fabian Society say, step by step, incrementally, we will create and push through Karl Marx's dream, but without having a violent revolution.
Yes.
That's what so people like Sadiq Khan, members of the Fabian Society, or have been. So all of this, you can trace many of the members of parliament that are in to they've got a membership of the Fabian Society. Soon after the Second World War, when Churchill, when we won the Second World War, there was an immediate election. Churchill lost the election, and Clement Attlee and the Labour Party then came into power. Their first Labour Party Prime Minister was a man called Ramsay MacDonald. There's Labour, they're all Fabians. And Attlee's government, many of the MPs, big amount of the MPs in membership there who had been elected, they were members of the Fabian Society. And I'd just like to point this out. What we have to remember during the Second World War, yes, Churchill was leading the war effort, but Attlee was running the country. And if you then go back to read the writings of the Webbs, and I just so happen to have a collection of their books, it's very interesting to read that, to read where we were as a nation in the 30s, late 20s, 30s, to read also their views on healthcare, because remember under the Attlee government there was education reform, but it was also then bringing in the National Health Service. So that is the sort of sets a mood in a way where this is relevant. And going back to the Canadian meeting, soon, within a few weeks, and a friend of mine will be there, we're going to have a COP. I don't know whether it's 29 or 30, I've forgotten. We're going to have that meeting in Brazil, in the rainforest in Brazil, where they have cleared trees to make a road. I don't know if that will also be a landing strip. Yes, they have. People, if you don't believe me, go and look that up. And a friend of mine, Alex Newman, who is editor of the New American, plus others, will be in attendance on our side to look at what's going on and draw attention to that. And that Brazil is run by Lula. Lula is a ex-union person. He's also been leader of Brazil in the past, and has then been accused of some inappropriate dealings with a petrochemical company. But he then ousted Bolsonaro. Lula was in prison, let out. He was out. He ousted Bolsonaro. And of course, sadly, and remember Bolsonaro in your prayers with what Bolsonaro has been through. Lula is socialist, so he will then love the COP meeting, and also last, I think it was the beginning of this year, when Keir Starmer came into power, who seems to have spent so much time on planes flying around the world giving our tax money away. One of the meetings he had was with Lula. Why am I saying this? Because you go back to Canada and realize all the relationships that these people have. Because I'm not going to go into it, but it then ties up with Southport, not because of the awful actions, dreadful actions of Rutager Barnard, who was then found guilty of murdering 3 beautiful young girls and injuring others and injuring adults in that room. But it's the fact that the sentences given to certain people there were, I think, unjust. Sadly, we think of Peter Lynch that died in prison, and I've just forgotten the lady's name that was given nearly a 3-year sentence for posting a comment on Twitter that she immediately took down and regretted saying that. And she has been recently released. I'll try and think of her name in a minute. I'll put the details below. But this, what it was about that suddenly, if they wanted to get people before a court quickly, they then suddenly found the fact that they could do it. Remember, the Southport incident then kicked off riots in this country, the establishment, and I'm not condoning any of the violence. What I will say is that the build up to this over many years, when we have open borders in certain other cases, then we need to look at who is actually in our country and are we actually vetting them. We've had other incidences of that, hence why people have been outside the migration hotels, quite rightly demonstrating about that. So there is a tie-up in how countries then start to push on tyranny, start to control what's on the media, and how people can then conduct their opinions. And recently, a few weeks, maybe 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, there was someone that was arrested because they'd put a meme up saying F Hamas and a couple of other comments.
Yes.
And he was then arrested in the dead of night and dragged off. And that particular police force have now said there's going to be no further action. I'm sure that there will be action on behalf of the gentleman that was actually dragged off. It's Lucy Connolly. Lucy Connolly. That's who I was thinking of earlier. So sorry, I do apologize, Nathan. On the one hand, it's a bit like a sort of long-winded answer, but I didn't realize what I'd made on one level, because I didn't expect COVID to happen in the way that it did. I say that the WEF, the wheel, the lockdowns, etc. But when we go back to history, this has been planned out for a long time. There's so many different layers of this. But of course, as you would quite rightly turn around and say to me, that there's this whole thing of biblical eschatology and the times that we are in. Now, I've named 2 films of mine. There's another film that I co-produced first AD called Abe about a nefarious robot. Maybe that's a little bit prophetic as well. Now that, written, directed by a very talented young man called Rob McKellen, that then went over to well over 1 million hits on YouTube and elsewhere. So for some reason, there's another called Always the Sun. This isn't about me promoting work. I'm just saying how it is. For some reason, I seem to have been involved or made things that might have said things a number of years ago, but are still saying things now. And hear me, I'm not calling myself a prophet at all. There's things that you see, and then you're led to make. So sorry, Nathan, it's long-winded.
No.
There we go.
I think that's very applicable where you looked at what's going on in the US, Jan 6, and then also put it back to Stockport, because in the UK at the moment, although our Herr Starmer
Southport,
Herr Starmer would say that we have freedom of speech in this country. The fact that we see so many people after that being arrested and still arrested or questioned by police for what they post on the internet. Yet only this week, a gentleman who was an immigrant, was a sex offender, was freed from prison by mistake and let out. And he'd only been given, I think, a year in prison anyway. He was supposed to be released somewhere else, and they let him out instead. So we see the kind of two-tier, which people often talk about, two-tier policing in our nation in relation to, if you challenge the government, you get arrested, or you might be, let's say, taken down to the police station, intimidated so you don't do it again. And then if you do a serious crime, well, you might not face as much as someone who just speaks out against the government. That's very applicable in relation to the films you've made, especially Lying Lambs and the Irish Echo, which talks about how this communist, or if you suspend the constitution, then what can happen? So I think they're very applicable in our nation. But just maybe touch on, you mentioned Abe's, the AI, and I know we're going to do a separate conversation on that this week, looking at AI. But all those things are applicable in relation to the social credit system of China, and in relation to the digital ID, which our government is bringing about. And I don't know if you want to touch on any of those things, because I think that's so applicable. You did a movie, and like you say, it's not about us being prophetic. It's about reading the scriptures, and they're applicable for today like never before, because they're being fulfilled. So I don't know if you want to expound upon the digital ID and also the AI just briefly, so that we can maybe go off on a tangent on something else.
No, not at all. Thank you. Well, I also made a film, part of making a film called Always the Sun. And in it, the heroine then has to touch a digital machine for fingerprint. Now, yeah, I know. I'm sort of reflecting back on this. I'm also
sorry, Mark, just in relation to now, people coming into the UK actually have to do that.
Yes, they do. I have done that in regard to 9 points of reference in regard to going into America. It's the biometrics.
Yes.
They are now stepping that up in regard to coming into the UK, in regard to Europe, in regard to the Schengen area. So it's all of this pushing for this digital control. They're coming after people that run their own businesses, because they want, in regard to dealing with HMRC, they want more and more of that digitally understandable. You could put your self-assessment in by a certain deadline, but they want more and more digital access, but they want you to use that more and more times to acknowledge who you are. Now, people would say, well, if there should be no problem with the digital ID, for argument's sake. Well, we've got a driving license that's got our birth on it. We have a passport already. If we're using our banking online, we're all used to that. Well, I don't like most of it, but we use it. And then, of course, if you are going on certain software, if you are going to pay for something on the bank, it then will say, go to your app. And sometimes there's 2 points of references. I mean, most will be like you at times. I've had absolute grief with it, and maybe with some of our dear listeners that are listening. But I'm watching. But the key thing is, it fundamentally is all about control, because in China, if you say anything that they deem to be inappropriate, then they will cut down and you won't be able to travel and you won't be able to go to, certain places or do certain things. There is a restriction. And I do know any time, as it's constantly said by American friends, any time a government takes rights away, it's not going to give them back. They don't come back unless it is violent. It's a violent insurrection in regard to that. And it is totally about control all the time. And let's just say this as well. We have to remember, and various people like David Starkey, one of our top historian, if not top historian we have, who is a conservative, who talks about this. He then takes us back to Israel. Sorry, not to Israel, to Tony Blair, right? Maybe there's a Freudian slip there. So with the Blair Foundation. So you go back to Tony Blair in 1997, and there is a seminal interview done by Peter Hitchens, where he turns around and said he sat down and had a chat with a journalist colleague of his who was leaving the newspaper, or not writing the column anymore in a particular newspaper. Peter knew him because he was going to go and work for the Blair government. Every single change in regard to our justice system, bringing in the Supreme Court, putting the European Court of Human Rights, embodying that into law, and all the other changes that we see, that comes down to the Blair government. You could argue that whole project is then led by Gordon Brown, definitely in the background, if we look at his background. So it's a collectivist socialist mindset, and they brought in public-private partnership, and I call that the new fascism, where government and private enterprise are combined, and that's what happened in Nazi Germany. That's what happened, because private companies got contracts of the Nazi regime, very much involved. IG Farben, the conglomerate that brought all the pharmaceutical industry of Germany together, led by Duisburg. The key is that they got these contracts. People call it and say, well, look at what private enterprise did. Yes, but they had to be members of the Nazi party to get that. Now, in regard to IG Farben, they contributed much to the coffers of the Nazi party. You and I have done a presentation of that and spoken about that at an event. So what am I saying is this whole thing of when university places expanded, academy schools and all of this, but we look back now at the number of younger generations that are well below us and a lot younger than us, and we look at how they behave, their beliefs, and in the end, I come down to the fact that they've been to school and it's turned into an indoctrination camp, or they've been to university, and that is what it's turned into. And that anyone else that has a voice that is a conservative voice politically, talking in world terms, then they are going to be pushed out, and they're not going to be listened to. And especially if you then believe, if you are a Christian, you believe in the Bible, then oh no, we're going to throw that out. So all of this, in regard to the tyranny, how we've reached where we are, has to be put in the pot, because we have to remember common law in this country, how it has evolved for hundreds of years. We then have to go back to Magna Carta. We know how Magna Carta has, of course, influenced the American Constitution. Yes, we do have a Bill of Rights Constitution. We do have that, even though it's argued that we're not, but we do have that. Mr. Moore, or Daddy Dragon, as he is called, he used to be regularly on YouTube under that name. But Mr. Moore is excellent at explaining all of that. I've now got even more notes to put in the description, but he is excellent. And I think, Nathan, something I'd like to say at this point, because people might say, well, we're discussing in sort of political or temporal terms. Ephesians 6 says that we're not fighting flesh and blood, but principalities and powers. And these are all a principality. And where we are at now in regard to the EU, on the June the 23rd, 2016, 17,410,752 people, with a majority of over 1 million, voted to leave the European Union. The European Union had evolved from 6 countries where you were able to trade with no tariff barriers, or if not minimum tariff barriers. And we were taken in 1973. We then, that's what Ted Heath did. We then had another referendum election on that in 1975. And it was still, no, we're going to go in. Remember, that's at a time where there were two television stations, a limited radio stations. And all of this, it was even a time, I think, that you could actually nearly park your car in 10 Downing Street, or you would be able to in Charles Street, that runs parallel, an area I know well. So all of this different mood at that time. So we were then we then went into what then became the European Union. We voted to leave. As soon as we voted to leave, members of parliament, vast majority of members of parliament, did whatever they could, including Keir Starmer, to take us back in all but name only. And that's what we have done. And you and I, like every single person in this country, has not been asked that, even after, inverted commas, a democratic vote. And let's just say this: under the Theresa May, or I'll call her Theresa May premiership, her regime, 2007, she came in after Boris Johnson, and then resigned, I think, early 2019. Boris Johnson then became leader of the party, and then won an 80-seat majority with an election in 2019, and he was fighting opposite Jeremy Corbyn. I'll give Jeremy Corbyn his due, even though I passionately disagree with his policies and his belief. But at least you know what you're dealing with. With Keir Starmer, you're not aware of anything that's below the waterline whatsoever, and that iceberg goes down so deep. So we then had that. Now, Theresa May also at that time signed what's called the Global Migration Compact. And sadly, like you, we won't go into it, but it's when we can't find the letters that we need to back up.
Yes,
We've had dealings with politicians, which I have had, and I got a letter back saying, "Oh, there's going to be no problem with us. It's not going to affect us in regard to the Global Migration Compact." Well, just see what's happening in regard to the channel, see in regard to people moving across the world. And it's another subject in many ways for another day, because it goes back to the wars that we have undertaken and the disruption of that, and in regard to people's moving. And we have seen, I want to say this, we've seen terrible deaths in, hundreds of thousands, millions of people dying because of certain actions. Now, we're not going to get, and I'm talking about particularly since the attack on the Twin Towers in 2001. Now, we are not going to get into a debate about that, but I'm just saying that was a very recent historical moment that is now 24 years ago. But look at all that has gone on in regard to Iraq, Afghanistan, and sadly all the lives lost and the people injured, and what people have suffered, and looking at the citizens of those countries. Then we've got to remember what happened in Libya. We look at the Arab Spring, because we've got to remember that this is a spiritual battle, and the entities that are behind all of that, because this is where we are. This is where we are now, having. We will get into this another time. Having just had the Prime Minister of the UK, the leader of France, Macron, so we've had Starmer, Macron, Carney, and Albanese recognizing Palestine as a state. Well, it doesn't fulfill any of the Montevideo Convention, so we'll just put that aside. But we've just had that, and it's all part of that, all part of this manipulation, because all of these people talk to each other. And as you and I have discussed, I do apologize, I'll stop and say it. You and I have discussed, when we have seen the awful river to the sea marches constantly, and this build up within an atmosphere spiritually, when we've seen ISIS flags, etc., on the streets of this country, that has stoked anti-Semitism in a way that we have never seen in our lifetime. And it's where we are as a nation, knowing we're not fighting flesh and blood, but principalities and powers. And that is how I see the tyranny unfolding. And also at time, here's a little tip. We've got to remember there's a duality that's going on all the time, and we have got to pay attention to that. We may see some good things, we think, but what is going on? What is around the corner? I'll give you a quick example. When President Trump is saying, "Oh, we have a peace deal," no, it's a ceasefire. Then he's got the Emir of Qatar on his plane. Why? When Qatar have had the Hamas leaders inside, they've been financing Hamas. They have the propaganda arm with Al Jazeera. So people have really got to work hard to find the truth. Nathan, I do apologize. I have gone on too much.
No, it's fine. I think you're exactly right with the spiritual battle. Everything we're seeing now is really a manifestation of the spiritual battle taking place. And we know that scripture tells us that when a demonic entity or a strong man is cast out, removed, it goes into a barren place. And then it comes back to the place once it's been swept clean. And if it sees that it's unoccupied, then it comes back 7 times more. And I've said so many times to people, and we've had conversations, that our nation now, because we've turned away from God and we're lawless, it allows all the old demonic entities which are being prevalent in our society to come back 7 times worse. And one within our society, sadly, has been anti-Semitism and how we've murdered Jews. And, Clifford's Tower, and that's a project, which is close to your heart, about doing some filming in York, where they dug up the Jewish cemetery and put a car park on top of it, and they call it Jubilee. All these things is showing the hatred of Jewish people and the anti-Semitism, and we're seeing that rife within our nation and growing because that has been a stronghold in our past, and it's resurfacing. So this spiritual battle is being seen, and I encourage anybody to really focus on Scripture, to look at Scripture, because even in your film and what you said at the beginning, that it looks at the removal of the Constitution, the suspension of the Constitution. Well, while in our country they would say that the laws still stand, it doesn't appear on the surface of what we're seeing that the laws in our nation are actually being applied correctly. And so we're seeing this, as everybody said, and we've hinted at it before, the two-tier policing. And so people should be concerned about that, because if you look at a communist country, people get arrested by the thought police, not because they've done anything wrong, but because they speak out against the government. And you mentioned the Chinese social credit system. I often say to people when I see Chinese people in our nation, not that I've got anything against the Chinese people, but I say, oh, there's a lot of Chinese people, they might say, doing tourist routes. That's because they've got a good social credit system. If they've got a very poor social credit system in China, they can't send their children to universities. They get a low-paid job. They have to rent in a certain area. They can't own a car. They have to sit in certain seats on buses, and they cannot leave the country. So people, if they can leave the country, and we see so many Chinese tourists, that means they have a very good social credit score. These people will not speak out against the government because they know what will happen. Because the Chinese government has people all the way through the nations who will inform on people. That is very similar to what we're finding in our nation, because people now have been programmed to actually speak out if someone does something wrong. And that's not breaking the law. That's what the government say is wrong. And you could say, well, is there a difference? Yes, there's a difference between the laws of the land and then oversight of the government saying that this is against the law when it really isn't. And so I think, well, I first of all encourage people to watch the film. I also would like to say that we know, when we've spoken prior to the shows, is that we can see from people accessing from my website that actually the amount of people viewing things is far greater than what we're seeing actually on YouTube. And we know that people don't want to get this information out in the UK. People watching might say, what, in the UK things are censored? Well, actually, in the UK, so China has the most cameras per person in the world. The next country is the United Kingdom. We are actually censored like a communist country, but we give the illusion of being something far more. And so I encourage people to really write comments, engage with us, also subscribe to the channels, so that, Mark's and mine, so that you can see what's going on, because we intend to give content for the UK, but also talking on a broader spectrum. So I've said enough, Mark, and I know you've done a lot of speaking, but it was about your what you've produced. And so really just think about, a minute, can you summarize, if you've got anything for anybody to say in relation to anything, tell us where they can find you. I know the links will be there, but just tell them. And also anything else you want to summarize with us. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you can find Between Lambs and Lions on YouTube. You can find the Iris Echo, IRIS Echo on YouTube as well. I'll put the links as below. Yes, it's censored. Yes, I am censored. I have been censored, having had in the past Facebook pages destroyed, taken down, and other things. I'll just quickly say this. I'm not going to give any names, but Nathan, you know the truth of this when we talk about this, that under the Theresa May administration in this country, when she was Prime Minister, there was a time when all the top execs, all the top commissioners of television, maybe film, were then invited into Downing Street and were told not to employ people that had views that they find politically incorrect. e.g. they're not going along with a transgender. They have comments to in regard to Islam, etc. So they were then told that that is a fact that happened, and of course it's then not talked about, but that has played out in regard to what happened when we shut down this country. That plays out in regard to television dramas that are then made, or if you then go for a job, then you are keeping quiet about your views, etc. And then people are checking you out on social media. This is real. Nathan, thank you.
No, I totally agree. And also Christians are taken out as well in relation to the media and other things. But just one final thought, Mark, because something we haven't talked about, and that is, you are writing a book, aren't you?
Yes, I already have one good chapter and one good chapter to expand on. And I need to, it will also be good for my own mental health. I need to expand on that to talk about what has gone on over the last 10 years. And in fact, one buffer, 10, maybe even a couple of more years, but one buffer to that is looking at Between Lambs and Lions, why I wanted to then produce that to where we are now. And that may have a touch of American politics. If we look at Roosevelt, we look at Straight's book, The Green New Deal, also Union with Britain Now. These are all, that is talking then about globalism. Roosevelt, of course, at Yalta had a discussion with bringing his dream of the United Nations about, discussing the goings on in regard to the United Nations. How many times they censor Israel is about 3 chapters, I think, in itself. Whether I write about that is another thing, but it is these global things. It's true. And then if you look at people like King Charles, when he was Prince Charles, his whole, of course, his fascination with the green agenda, the WEF. This is real. There was a book written by a wonderful woman called Joan Vion called the Sustainable Prince. This is all real. Very often, I think that sometimes when we're crossing over the North Atlantic to America, so we go through a veil because things and information is actually denied us here in the UK. We're coming against the hour, my friend, and I do apologise.
No, we've got 2 minutes, but I'm going to give you one more minute because I'm going to put you on the spot as well. You've also got another script you're writing. We don't need to go into that if you don't, but you are writing another script, and that will be very applicable with what's going on as well today. So just to let people know that Mark has got a few projects there as well as all his podcasting, but there's the book and a new script which he's writing. And so that would, please pray for Mark, pray that God will give him wisdom to write and the time, and also increase his time to get these key tools for information out there which we can share with people. So thank you, Mark, for the discussion. I've enjoyed it, and I hope people will enjoy watching the films and also looking at the links. And I look forward to our next discussion. So thank you.
And thank you, my friend. Plus, also, there's a couple of projects burgeoning in America, and watch this space because there will be more. I'm going to play us out because we are well against the time. Thank you, my friend. Thank you, everyone, for watching.